Yeah, please.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. We are a consortium of about 70 plus groups in Massachusetts, planning ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Brady Crytzer. And Brady Crytzer teaches history at Robert Morris University, and he is an historian of the American frontier, probably one of the leading historians of Pennsylvania history and Pennsylvania's military history. He's the author of Battlefield Pennsylvania, which goes along with a series he did for Pennsylvania's public broadcasting network on Pennsylvania battlefields. And he wrote a book about Fort Pitt, as well as a book about Major Washington's Pittsburgh, and Gayasuta and the Fall of Indian America. We're really here to talk, though, about your latest book, which is The Whiskey Rebellion, a distilled history of an American crisis. So, Brady, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you for having me.
So the Whiskey Rebellion, it's one of those things everyone knows happened, but no one knows much else. And your book really does tell the story and makes us see why it is important. Now, what brought you to the story of the Whiskey Rebellion?
Bob, it's a really challenging story. I live on a piece of property that borders the property of one of the men that was actually arrested for his participation in the event. And I think a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania could probably say that and not realize it. So it's a book that's very complicated. It's been misunderstood, I think, throughout the last 230 years as maybe an epilogue to the American Revolution or a bookend of some kind. But it's really an insight into the early republic. And it challenges us. I mean, all of the men who participate in the uprising are patriot veterans, and we celebrate them for that. But just 10 years later, they're trying to dismantle the republic in a secessionist movement. So there must be some messiness there. And I think I felt comfortable jumping into it to sort it out for people.
Yeah, there's a great deal of messiness in it because you do have these people who had been on the same side, but they have kind of a somewhat different idea about what the republic was and what their powers were under the republic. You had this government in Philadelphia. One of the things I kept thinking, Alexander Hamilton looms large in this. And I don't remember a song about the Whiskey Rebellion in the musical. So
no, they mentioned the word whiskey one time in that musical, and I think for good reason. He doesn't come out of that looking, I think, like the way they might want to portray him in that series, but that's history, right?
That's right. Yeah. And there's some other fascinating characters in this, both major characters as well as minor characters. Like one of the most interesting is Herman Husband.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Herman Husband is one of these people that really shows how much work we still have to do on the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was divided into really three sects of people. There were the moderates, people like Albert Gallatin, the extremists that turned to violence, people like David Bradford. And then there were these sort of apocalyptic end time types like Herman Husband, who believed that, as foretold in the book of Revelation, the world was ending and the Whiskey Rebellion was how it would happen. And he lived like a hermit on top of a mountain in the wilderness, and he had followers, and they all kind of coalesced in this one event. It's really unusual.
It's extraordinary. And then he was preaching about the New Jerusalem and about, and it's fascinating. I mean, the way you bring these characters to life is really great in the book. Why don't we just tell a little bit about why whiskey? Was it about whiskey, and what provokes this?
The Whiskey Rebellion, was never called the Whiskey Rebellion in its own time. It was always called the Western Insurrection, which makes the stakes much higher. But the reason whiskey comes to the forefront is because in the 1790s, President Washington had a very real concern that America was really dividing into two different countries. And they were physically divided between East and West. And the Appalachians were the division. He knew that people in the East respected American sovereignty. He knew that they respected the Constitution. But in the West, there wasn't a real connection to people beyond the Appalachian Mountains. His fear was that they would attach themselves more towards Spain on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers.
Yeah, Spain was paying some of the people out west, too, to be more
Absolutely. I mean, it was cheaper to ship goods. People have trouble visualizing this, but it was cheaper to ship goods from Philadelphia to London than it was from, say, Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. Much cheaper, in fact.
Wow.
So they would send these goods down the river, and they'd end up in New Orleans, and it was a lucrative relationship there when times were good between Spain and America. So it was Alexander Hamilton that believed that the way you unify a people, and I always get a laugh out of this, but is through taxation.
Right.
If you have to pay your tax to someone, to a government, then you'll inherently recognize their sovereignty over you. And whiskey was the primary produce of the West. Corn, rye made a very fine whiskey. They made a lot of it. It was the center of their economy. So in 1790, Hamilton creates an excise tax. That's a tax on a domestically produced good. And it's on whiskey. And it's the first time ever in American history. He would say it was done to unify the country. But Western farmers, and this is true from Pennsylvania through North and South Carolina, Kentucky, they saw it as an inherent infringement of their rights.
Right. And so he imposes the tax, and then there is outrage for a lot of, by the way, you do a really good job of breaking the book down into 3 parts that are kind of modeled on the process of making whiskey.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And so they react with the kinds of protests we had seen before the revolution, meetings, and then actually physical attacks on the excise collectors or on people more there to enforce the law.
It was, it's an era of gesture politics, and people hear about tax collectors who are from the area where these attacks are happening, Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, and they're very violent attacks, tarring and feathering and burning with branding irons. And I always draw people back to the Boston Tea Party. This is an era of gesture politics, showing something and it's meant to be seen. It's meant to be sending a message. And that's what this was. I mean, when the first tax collectors are attacked, and they're very brutal attacks, the men who attack them dress like Native American warriors. Because at the same time that the Whiskey Rebellion's happening, there's the Northwest Indian War against Little Turtle's Western Confederacy in Woodstock, Ohio. And that's adding extra pressure to Western farmers. They're being attacked by Indian raids all the time. So they paint themselves as Indians. They make these bold public statements. And unfortunately for the tax collectors, they suffer physical bodily harm on behalf of the Treasury Department who's employing them.
Right. Yeah. And then you have people who then do register their stills or show sympathy. They're attacked too. I mean, the mob is not just going after these visible tax collectors, but against anyone who might be sympathetic with that side.
We have, in the revolution, we have Tories, right? These are people who maybe don't attach themselves to the patriot cause early on. You have a similar kind of intense dislike of loyalists, if you would, in the Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah. If you did play by the rules, if you did register your still, you would wake up one day and it would be destroyed. Yeah. There was a group of people, and it's not one person, but it's really a group that would call themselves Tom the Tinker. And they would find someone who played by the rules. They'd destroy their still, they'd burn their barn, and they'd leave a note. And it would say, Tom the Tinker's men were here. And that was a fear tactic. That was a form of intimidation.
Yeah. We're talking with Brady Crytzer, who is the author of The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis. And I mean, a lot of the things in the book really I found interesting as well as surprising. One, that Washington, Pennsylvania was actually bigger than Pittsburgh at this time. And that seems to be one of the real hot points for this rebellion, Washington County and then Washington itself. And another point you make in the book is that a lot of the leaders of this were leaders in the community, like John Hamilton, no relation to the Treasury Secretary. He's the colonel of the militia. And the Hamiltons are really among the leaders of this insurrection or this movement.
The best way to think of it is so you have Allegheny County and then you have Washington County, and they stack on top of one another. Allegheny County, the seat is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a federal city. It is, I always like to call it one of the capitals of the frontier. There's a federal fort, there are federal buildings, federal agencies. It's a federal city, but it's surrounded by a sea of very anti-federal sentiment, farmers. So just south of it is Washington County, and Washington County is growing. It has a county seat also called Washington, named after the general.
Mm-hmm.
These people are never anti George Washington.
Right.
He's what rises above for them. But it's a growing fast city. It'll have mansions. It'll look like almost like a miniature Baltimore, if you could think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And people there are educated and wealthy. But it's around Washington where you have these hollows, very Appalachian kind of places with Scots-Irish families. And these ruling families almost become like gangs, almost like the Hatfield and McCoy gangs. They have people attached to them. They have influence. John Hamilton is the sheriff of the region. He's one of the primary leaders of the rebellion, and he's also the governor appointed head of the state militia. So if there was, say, an uprising, he would be the one to have to put it down, and he's the one responsible.
Right.
So it's very tribal in a way, and I think when you study the frontier, you kind of learn this shorthand that develops.
Yeah. So another of the characters who is a real two characters who are important generally in American history, but really play a big role in this, are William Findlay and Albert Gallatin. And Gallatin is a relatively new arrival on this frontier. He's from Switzerland, and he has set up an estate, a glass works he wants to sort of glass works at Friendship Hill, and he plays an interesting role in all of this.
Yeah, Gallatin, he comes to America, as you mentioned, from Geneva, because he gets very, I think, disenchanted by the old world. And when he sees America, he spends time in Boston. He says this is a direct quote, terribly boring is what he says. He sees the frontier as this just blank canvas. I mean, the real America that he read about. Right. And he sees rivers and hills and valleys, and he sees places that you can literally start cities from scratch.
Yeah.
So he moves to the far southwestern corner of Pennsylvania, and he establishes a town. He wants to call it New Geneva. He's an interesting character. He's a short man, thick accent, but the people of the West really embrace him because he's a true believer, and he believes in what they're capable of. He believes in the future. I'm just finishing a book now on the National Road, and it's really Gallatin's story on what he's doing. So I'm really in Gallatin mode here. But he speaks for those people, and he always does. At the time, he's in the Pennsylvania Assembly. Right. And he is responsible early on for helping them organize their grievances. Why is this law a problem? Why is it harmful to our way of life? And he helps them compile it in a document. And he and Findlay will actually deliver those documents themselves to the Capitol. Gallatin will deliver the grievances to the state assembly, and William Findlay is the congressman at large for Western Pennsylvania. He'll deliver them to the to the House of Representatives. So Gallatin is there early on. Once it gets out of control, when it turns violent, he leaves. Yeah, and he will say that his participation was, quote, his only political sin. And for a lifelong politician, that's a big admission.
That is. And it really makes him a target for Alexander Hamilton. And these two really do form polarity because, of course, Gallatin becomes the Secretary of the Treasury, which is a much different idea about national development than Hamilton had. Hamilton very much top down and will tell you what is best. And Gallatin and the Jeffersonians really looking at these organic ways of creating national wealth.
That's a great way to see it. I call him the anti-Hamilton in a way. He'll have that's the name of the musical. Yes, exactly. It would be a boring one too. He was famous for when he was in Washington, having young congressmen come to his house to counsel them, and never serving alcohol. So he was well known for that. But he would serve Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams. Distinguished career, but it all kind of began from a trauma, and that trauma was the Whiskey Rebellion. That's where he learned the danger of maybe populism unconstrained.
Yeah. And then Hamilton engineers his ouster from the Senate when the legislature elects him in the early in the wake of all of this.
Yeah, very familiar tones of today's world. He's a Genevan in a new country. He's elected to the United States Senate, and immediately upon his election, a conspiracy develops led by Hamilton to get him ousted. And their reason is that he can't be trusted. He's a foreigner. He's an outsider. How could we trust him even when he becomes a member of the Jefferson administration?
Yeah.
People will say, how could he talk to Napoleon, right? In his own native language. Can we really trust this guy? It was a very telling time, I think. And again, we see these themes today.
We do. And William Finley serves in Congress. He's He's an opponent of the ratifying the Constitution in 1788, but then he becomes a 1787-88. He serves with a long, distinguished career, and he also writes one of the first histories of this event in the wake of it.
Finley is he'll eventually be named the father, and it's a ceremonial title, the father of the House of Representatives. He's long, distinguished career. Very well established, man of the people, Jeffersonian type, really before that emerges. And he is suspicious of this law from the beginning. And he's involved in a lot of the early proceedings. And again, they are not violent. They're listing grievances, making resolves, what the Constitution tells these farmers they're allowed to do.
Right.
But even as the rebellion goes on, he becomes a target. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton will list him as a ringleader of the movement when he wasn't, really as a means of, redress for their political differences. And Finley gives us one of the great histories of the rebellion. And there's a couple of people that do this, and then he'll interview people, he'll interview neighbors, get firsthand accounts, and it's incredibly valuable to historians. But the underlying theme of that book is, I was there, but I'm not guilty. Okay. He's always writing, I was there, but I'm not one of these maniacs that went too far. That is to exonerate himself.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, the other one who writes a history is Hugh Henry Breckinridge, who has been
very similar.
Friend of Madison's, classmate of Madison's at Princeton. And then he's out there on the frontier, and he's also involved and writes a history. The Gallatin, Finley, and Breckinridge are all somewhat moderates in this, and they all don't go as far as some of the others. David Bradford's, he seems like a classic demagogue. I mean, he arrives on the scene and is always trying to figure out which way will get him, which way to lead this group who seems to be already going in one direction. And
I would agree. Yeah, David Bradford, after the rebellion turns violent, Bradford really isn't involved until the very end. He's kind of a cheerleader. He's from Maryland, very wealthy, not a frontiersman. And when the rebellion turns violent, the leadership, like Finley, like Gallatin, they flee. They don't want to be involved in this. And Bradford kind of gets roped into taking over the rebellion at its most dangerous point. And he embraces it. He calls himself the Robespierre of the West. He shows up riding on a white horse. He has military medallions, and he's never served. No one knows where he gets these medallions. And the rebels rally around him. And he's the one that transforms this from being an anti-tax protest to ultimately a secessionist movement. He will send representatives to Louisiana to meet with the Spanish Empire. He'll have a flag made for the counties that are in rebellion against the United States. And he'll ultimately attempt to sack Pittsburgh, the federal city. So he's the one that, again, always will conflate himself, raise himself. He raids the mail coming out of the federal mail coming out of Pittsburgh. And he'll say this just because he wants to know what people are saying about him. And there's letters in there from Alexander Hamilton. And he wants to know, do people realize that I'm the face of this movement now? So he comes in at the end, and he's kind of, I think, one of the least appealing characters, or at least appetizing characters that comes out of this, because we know people like this, and we still know them, and they serve the same purpose.
Yeah, right, they do. We're talking with Brady Crytzer, author of The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis. And, of course, one of the big episodes in 1794, Washington, in response to all of this violence on the frontier and the threat of burning Pittsburgh, he leads an army west. And about 12,000 men mustered from these four states who are going out to suppress this insurrection, which, again, that's a fascinating story. It's the last time a president led troops into a confrontation like this.
Yeah, into the field of battle. Yeah. So Washington has really given this thought. He sees domestic rebellion. He reads his constitutional duties, but he doesn't have a federal army at his disposal to call upon. He does have some semblance of that with Anthony Wayne, but they're near Cincinnati preparing to fight the Indian warriors of the West. So he'll call upon the governors of Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia, and he'll give them a quota, and he asks for 15,000 men. These are all state militia. These are not veterans of the American Revolution. They're kind of the next generation. And he'll call up 13,000 of them. And the only reason he doesn't get his 15,000 is because Western Pennsylvania and Western Virginia were part of that quota, and they all went to the rebel side.
Right.
But he will have, a pretty impressive list of people leading the way. Of course, the governors of the different states will lead their armies, and the governor of Virginia is Light Horse Harry Lee.
Okay.
And Light Horse Harry Lee's second in command is going to be Daniel Morgan. So, these are incredibly important players in the American Revolution, and they're being called up right again, just 1794. Just the decade after the revolution ends. But Washington will lead them himself. He has a bad back at the time, so he rides in a carriage. Alexander Hamilton is at his side, as a Treasury Secretary would be, right, in the field of battle. He's right. And Washington always had this idea that when he crossed over the mountains that separate Pennsylvania, there's a federal fort there, Fort Bedford, right at the foot of the mountain. And he believed if he got to Bedford and it was still in federal control, the rebellion was probably contained in the West. And when he got to Bedford threw a big celebration for President Washington, balls and galas. And he said, I think, we're probably okay. And Washington would go back to Philadelphia at that point. But it was Light Horse Harry Lee and Alexander Hamilton that would march the army the rest of the way into whiskey country, as they called it. And as the army marched in, fortunately, the insurrection kind of lost its spine a bit. Rebel leadership fled Pittsburgh. David Bradford escaped down the Ohio and Mississippi into Spanish territory. And he'd live in exile there for years as a result. And when the army arrived, I say in my book, they became the largest police force in American history, 13,000 men, because they went on a spree of arresting hundreds of rebels or even suspected rebels. A lot of them without proper due process. They'd keep men locked in basements without food and water for days at a time. They would march them through rivers and streams. It's wintertime now, November 1793, barefoot, just to inflict damage and torment. And that was sort of the I guess the cost of sedition for them. I should note that in the West, they called it the Dreadful Night.
Yes.
Because it was viewed as so cruel and inhumane. But when the federal army, or excuse me, the state militias came to Pittsburgh, they dropped the hammer very, very profoundly. Yeah.
How did it get the name the Watermelon Army?
So the Westerners would always try to portray everything that the Easterners did as right as politicians do, as backwards or wrong. And the idea was all these whiskey rebels were Revolutionary War veterans, battle-hardened patriots, right? They were on the good side in their minds. So the Watermelon Army was the name that the New Jerseyans and the Pennsylvanians really more than anyone else got, because these were young guys and they were not well trained and they were not well disciplined, and they would terrorize farmers on the way to meeting the whiskey rebels. They would eat their food, tear down their fences. They would get in fist fights. We even have an example of a soldier murdering another soldier in a duel, just seemingly because they were bored, right? Sitting around too long. So they were viewed as like an undisciplined bunch of greenhorns, if you would. And the Watermelon Army was a label that came to them. It was a pejorative, sort of like, they're out there. We fought the British. They're out there fighting watermelons.
Yeah, the governor of New Jersey even wrote a marching song for the New Jersey troops as a way of helping to spur enlistments.
Yes, he wrote Onward, Jersey Blues. It's interesting. When you look at newspapers in the East Coast, they are resoundingly in favor of suppressing this rebellion. Again, it was never called the Whiskey Rebellion in its
Mhm.
time. It was called the Western Insurrection. And,
Right.
and from President Washington's viewpoint, look at the terror that's taken over in France,
Right.
the unrest there. Washington views what's going on his Western flank as maybe an extension of what's going on in Europe. It looks,
Right.
if you take that zoomed out view, it looks like the world's burning itself to the ground.
Mhm.
And Washington is very aware that he's the first president. He does not want to lose this republic. So I think that shadows or colors a lot of his decision making in the process. But there is strong support for what they end up doing in the East, as you mentioned, especially New Jersey and New York.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we're talking with Brady Crytzer, author of The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis. Again, if we just look at what's happening in Western Pennsylvania, we see their grievances against this excise tax, which does hit them. But then you're right, there's this bigger picture that Washington is seeing, not only with the native people in Ohio, which of course the Pennsylvanians also recognize, but the fact that the British are arming them and that Spain wants to control the Mississippi River, and then overall seeing this turmoil in France. And you have the Bradford calling himself the Robespierre of America, and people setting up liberty poles and doing other things, which seem to be not simply, hey, we don't like this tax, but let's get rid of all authority.
Right. Yeah, it's not really about whiskey, which is the curious thing about the name of the event. It's about sovereignty. It's about, do we have to follow the rules even if we don't like them? And those are the big questions that Americans deal with all the time. And I think this book, hit on that nerve. It's done very well. I'm very grateful for it. It's hit that nerve in kind of the world we live in today for that same reason.
Yeah. And then you have people like Gallatin and Finley weighing, so what happens if this area does secede, or if we don't have to follow the rules? And if Washington shows he can't enforce the law in a place that doesn't want this particular law enforced. So we understand these folks in Western Pennsylvania know they're going to be outvoted in Congress, but then what's the alternative? And you make the point, this is the largest insurrection like this until 1861, when South Carolina was seceded.
Absolutely. It's a really compelling thing. Like you said, it's one of the great crises of Washington's presidency, of many. It's one of many simultaneous military expeditions going on at the same time. But it's not just a Western Pennsylvania event. I mean, it's the most venomous here, because I think they have the greatest, the greatest investment in whiskey overall.
Yeah. But
in Kentucky, the federal government saw similar resistance, and they deemed the law unenforceable there. Like, just even try. People forget the largest whiskey distiller in America was President Washington at the time.
That's true. Yeah.
So there were people that were following the rules here and paying that tax, but there was a unique collusion of events in Western Pennsylvania, specifically in Western Virginia. I want to stress that that made it the worst here. There was, of course, the Indian War on the frontier. But remember, the British are still posted up in the Northwest Territory. They haven't left yet. The Spanish have closed the Ohio River to commerce. So farmers, again, are feeling the pressure from that. And when you factor those three things in, the Whiskey Rebellion is just sort of what finally breaks the dam. Too many pressures at once that boil over.
So do these rebels ultimately get what they want, or are they completely suppressed? Is the thing about the tax on whiskey as the thing that really motivates them, or the thing that pushes them to this point?
Well, there's a short term and a long term.
Yeah.
In the short term, the people that were involved in the rebellion pay a pretty hefty penalty.
Yeah.
They literally pay that in fines. Some of them lose their livelihoods, lose their homes and farms. Some of them are arrested. 35 men, including Herman Husband, who we mentioned, will be locked in the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia, right by Independence Hall, for a year. And Husband will be treated so badly there, he'll die about a week after release.
Wow.
So he'll pay the price there, of course. The way it's resolved, however, though, is that it becomes the real fodder for President, or at the time, Vice President Thomas Jefferson's presidential run. He'll say this event is the ultimate in federal overreach, the ultimate in abuse of power. You've been led by the hand enough by men like Hamilton and Adams. that's turning the reins over to someone who will give the power back to you. And that's actually where we get the name Whiskey Rebellion. Because Jefferson will call it what everyone called it, the Western Insurrection. And Hamilton, in an effort to minimize it, will say, well, that, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that really wasn't an insurrection. That was just a little whiskey rebellion, is what he says.
Yeah.
And 230 years later, that political spin is still taking hold. I mean, the book is called The Whiskey Rebellion.
That's right.
Jefferson will be the one that does strike down the law in 1802.
Great. And we think about the song about Copper Kettle, and my granddad made whiskey. My daddy made it too. We haven't paid no whiskey tax since 1792. So,
that's right.
Yeah. We're talking with Brady Crytzer about his book, The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis. And one of the things you do really nicely in the book is tell us what we can see if we go to any of these places that you mentioned. I mean, you do have a great map in the book, but then thinking about what the area looked like then, what it looks like now, it's one of the great things about doing history, but also one of the real challenges when the landscapes change.
It's, preservation here in Western Pennsylvania, especially, always took a backseat to commerce and industry. Pittsburgh was the steel city, but before that it was the iron city. And I always joke before that it was the whiskey city. That's kind of the progression we've had. But people lived with these places. They lived in these places. The oldest building in Pittsburgh is the Block House, which was attached to Fort Pitt. That was a private residence for most of the 19th century. They're practical people. If there's good, strong buildings, they will live there. And what we have, especially in the Whiskey Rebellion, compared to a wonderful city like Boston, that has every bit of its revolutionary history marked out and at least attempted to be made available for the public to learn. Many of these places here in the West have been either neglected and have fallen into ruin, or are just part of people's lives and they don't even realize it. Anyone who lives in, for example, Western Pennsylvania or the northern panhandle of Western Virginia is probably within 20 minutes of a Whiskey Rebellion site. And as someone who lived here, I knew where these places were, and I thought, it's not a guidebook, but I thought the information was too good not to share, because it's a real connection to kind of the down and dirty state of preservation and historical memory in a place that doesn't get a lot of attention, and certainly in an event that does not get a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's true. We've been talking with Brady Crytzer. I know we've talked about a lot. Is there more? Is there some thing we should tell folks? I mean, we want them to read the book, but anything we've left out that we should address before we let you go?
I always just like to take this moment to remind people things are not great, right, in the country. And anytime you ask someone that throughout American history, they would probably say that. But the Whiskey Rebellion was terrible, and we survived. We have a constitution. It works. We have to believe in it, put our faith in each other and in democracy. And I think that's kind of the takeaway from the book. But it also underscores a larger idea that, when the revolution ended, in a lot of ways, the work was just beginning.
Right.
The war was what it was. It was difficult and it was victorious, but keeping a republic is the real challenge of our system, but also the beauty of it.
It really is. And we've seen over the long history that even though it seems very difficult, toppling the bad old regime is easier than setting up one that won't be worse. And that's one of the real marvels of our revolution, is that the system that emerges actually partly through crises like this, doesn't allow the regime since then to lock people up for a year. And do you think Hamilton, by the way, do you think the Washington administration was overreacting?
I think Hamilton, I get into some difficulty with this. I think Hamilton had a vision. I also think he may have gotten the result he wanted. As early as 1792, if you look at the meetings and the documents, Hamilton is advocating military response. And he's advocating military response at a time when men like Edmund Randolph and President Washington are saying this is beyond a reasonable reaction to this. So there were things, put into this this law by Hamilton that I think were intended to be controversial, intended to be maybe incendiary to the West. But I do think Hamilton, like Washington, believed that Westerners had posed a real threat of aligning with the Spanish more than their own country. And Hamilton viewed this as a way of maybe making them bend the knee, making them accept the sovereignty of the federal government. Hamilton was a very partisan man. He believed in the strength of the federal government. He believed in that a military response was justified. And again, the fact that he had such a personal attachment to the event, and he even kept a list of people he called, and this is a direct quote, he called them the big fish. He wanted to see arrested and hanged. And they were just by chance his great political enemies. So, like I said, in the musical, I think there's a reason they glance or gloss over this event because they complicate the story a little bit. It really does make him a different character and than the guy we see in the musical. So, by the way, were there any foreign responses? Did Britain, any of the other countries, take note of this, or was it? That's really interesting. Britain and France are going to view this very differently. And that's obvious because of the situation of what's going on there. The French are going to be sympathetic with the Westerners for obvious reasons. The British view Washington's response as correct and also too late. He should have sent in troops much earlier. And that was the general feeling. And again, you could probably gather why based on the kind of political makeup of both places at the time. Generally, the monarchists of Europe were supportive of what Washington did because, quite honestly, it's probably what they would have done. Right.
We've been talking with Brady Crytzer. We can keep going on all day, I think, probably talking about this, but we know you have a life to get back to. Brady Crytzer, author of The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis, as well as many other books. And so thanks so much for joining us, Brady. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the chance.
And I should also mention that you are featured in the new Fox Nation series, Young Washington, because you've written about Major Washington's Pittsburgh. And as you said, you really are, this is kind of the bookend from the 7 Years' War to the Whiskey Rebellion. It's a great period in American history. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Jonathan Lane, our producer, and to our listeners around the world. So every week I thank some of you folks who are tuning in regularly. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan Lane an email, janelane@revolution250.org. And this week, folks in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Hewitt, New Jersey, Hingham, Massachusetts, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is actually the hometown of William Findlay, Okmulgee, Oklahoma, Pattaya in Thailand, Tel Aviv, Rio de Janeiro, Takasaki, Japan, in Michigan, Detroit and Ann Arbor, Omaha, Nebraska, Lewisburg, North Carolina, and places beyond and between. Thanks for joining us. Now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.